So after this very interesting conference, we can open the discussion. There are someone who want to ask something or make comments. We go from very experimental questions to theological questions, philosophical questions. So it's very interesting. And we have many religions here that can have intervention. Please.
Yeah. I would like to thank Werner Arber, who first brought the concept of the genesis as how it had been described in the early understanding and the actual evolution of the biological world. And I'd like to address the problem of creation. And there is a very small little book by Cardinal Ratzinger, before he was Pope, called In the Beginning. And they were the Lent homilies, 4 Lent homilies in the Frauenkirche in Munich. And the conclusion of the book is, for Catholics, Christians, we need creation in order to have a Redeemer, that would be Jesus, that comes and saves us. So without creation, then the basis of the Catholic religion would be lost. So it's a very important problem, the one of creation, because, as you know, the Catholic religion has been the basis of Western civilization. So just was more of a comment, but having a thinker like Werner fusing philosophy and nature, Naturphilosophen. Vielen Dank.
Well, I appreciate your information which you gave to us. I think it fits very well with our ideas.
John, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I have 2 questions, one for Professor Lutz and one for our thought experimentalists, actually, the second one. First of all, your presentation was very impressive, in particular the data you presented, because it's the real thing we can see. I have a question you also showed, which is quite amazing, how life expectancy correlates and is actually supported by education. But of course, education is produced by many factors. So it's not just the educational system. So if you have higher education, you may also need talent for that. So I just wonder whether a similar curve exists relating life expectancy and IQ. So maybe, and the second question would be, I'm a little bit uncertain whether what you presented, part of it is really a thought experiment or just theory. For example, the Maxwell demon is clearly a thought experiment because there is no such little creature that is opening the door for the molecules and shutting them down again. Or the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen experiment is clearly a thought experiment in the beginning. While Malthus, I thought, you know, exponential growth versus arithmetic growth in food production is more a theory, actually, a justified hypothesis. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting point. Yes, this is always a challenge in the social sciences when you have very closely interwoven developments, like the growth of income, the improvement in life expectancy, and the improvement in education. So there's always a danger of spurious associations. In the past, really most scholars coming from economics tended as a given that it was sort of living conditions, that both triggered the historic decline in mortality in the 19th century and improving living conditions being the basis for the modern decline in the developing countries after World War II. Now, some recent analysis shows that indeed, if you go to Sweden, which really was the first country that also had the highest life expectancy in the 19th century, it really was at a point when the Swedish population was already largely literate, and then it had first public health efforts, they had early forms of vaccination, there were midwives being sent to the villages, so it was a sort of organization infrastructure together with individual capabilities of knowing what to do essentially it was let the child survive. And so for that reason it wasn't surprising to us when we challenged the question that income really is the main driver and then tried to do the similar parallel analysis for education, and indeed it brought up a more convincing picture. Even in developing countries today, child mortality is very much a function of the education of women. But of course, the women, they need to know to boil the water before they feed it to the child, and such very simple things that women who at least attended 1 year of school already know better than those who have never been there. But coming to your point in terms of the IQ, unfortunately we don't have systematic data on IQ. That is one of the issues. And IQ, of course, is both very closely related to the early childhood experiences. And in early childhood, really the health dimension and the cognitive dimension come very closely together. I mean, they reinforce each other, and that is important. And sort of if you want to enhance human capital, it is really to focus on early childhood development, both that they have the sufficient nutrition as well as they have sufficient cognitive stimulation in order to enhance their IQ. And we have this Flynn effect that the IQ has increased over time. And there is no consensus, but most scientists believe it is actually a function of better education, particularly better education of parents who then can better stimulate their children in early childhood and provide them also with the right living conditions and good health. So this is, I mean, I'm not sure whether it's an answer, but particularly these at early childhood, the two are very much interwoven. IQ clearly has a genetic component, but also has a component of environment and of living conditions. And the big research questions, maybe where some here in the room can help, is whether there possibly can be an epigenetic inheritance of acquired skills and education. As I see, the literature is really inconclusive. But if this were the case, this would be another strong reinforcing mechanism of intelligence and human capital.
Well, thank you for this question about thought experiments. There is a broad range of very different thought experiments and of scientific theories, and there is no generally accepted definition of what a thought experiment is. I mean, in the narrow sense, a thought experiment involves really imagining that a real experiment be done, as in the case of Maxwell's demon. But there's also a wider sense of thought experiments, and the point we wanted to emphasize was in particular the use of imagination, imagining the world to be in a certain way in which it is not known to be, or in an area where it has not been observed or is perhaps not even observable. So imagining certain facts to be the case and then asking the question, what would happen then? What would happen under these assumptions? And we would like to emphasize in particular the contrast between this imaginative mode of reasoning and a more deductive or more algorithmic mode of scientific reasoning, where, for example, implications of a theory are deduced by using logic. We believe that this is also important, of course, but it is not the only way of scientific reasoning.
May I just say that the authors of the Genesis chapter, several thousand years ago, of course, didn't know that there are bacteria. They didn't know that they lived on a planet which is round like a ball, because they were living on a more or less flat land. They were near the ocean, so what they reflected there is, for me, absolutely fantastic. They start the Genesis with constructing the world in which they live, the heaven, and separating water from land. And then they reflected what are the first living organisms. They didn't know bacteria, so they reflected, I cannot have been there, I wouldn't have found any nutrition. And they also knew that animals usually feed with plants, so they start with plants, then animals, and then humans. I find this history an absolutely fantastic example for a thought experiment.
We don't have only 4 minutes because we have a very intensive morning. So one question more, and Salvador is first.
The mentioning of thought experiments is very, very important at this stage, at least for biologists. We are living in a time in which technology is driving science to such an extent in which there is a threat, I think, for the thought experiment. In biology, it's very important to have the thought experiment before you actually go to the laboratory for scientific experimentation and putting the idea to test. So I am very, very grateful that that has been mentioned here, because I think it's a very, very important component of science. But I wanted to ask a question in relation to the presentation, which is, given the possibility that Homo sapiens is now moving into a subspecies of Homo sapiens literata, do you think doing a thought experiment and taking into account all the difficulties that we are having in that process, that in the next 100 years the whole human species will become sapiens literata, or we will be divided in 2 species, one literata and the other one that is not literata, that will be so divided that we will not be able to interbreed, for example?
Yes, I mean, the good news is
very brief.
very brief, that as you've seen, 90% of the population was illiterate in 1900, and now 90% is literate. Only 10% is illiterate. And of course, most of the young people now have an opportunity to go to school, and if the Sustainable Development Goals with universal primary and secondary education succeed, yes, we will have a universal literacy. But it's not granted in some countries, particularly in Africa. Some countries actually have declining education rate. You have groups like Boko Haram who explicitly fight education, and together with high population growth, this may indeed also result in an increase of uneducated people.